Hello everyone, welcome back. So in the previous video, we had created a user inside of Firebase, and we had also saved some of the corresponding data to that user in the Firestore database. So now in this video, we are ready to actually create the authentication logic for our application. So to start off, what we're going to do is that inside of our lib folder, we're going to create a new folder, and we'll call this folder providers. Then I'm just going to create a new file, and I'm going to call this file our auth provider.dart. Now, before I now create the actual auth provider class, I would like to address a simple issue, and that being that why we are using the provider framework. And the reason being is that I wanted to actually show you how you could actually use a third-party library to manage state inside of your application and not just rely on Firebase to manage your state, even though our app is solely using Firebase, and Firebase is really good at storing the state of an application and actually managing it internally so that we don't have to define our custom state management logic. But since I wanted to actually show you how you could use the provider framework, which is a really powerful state management framework and something that Flutter developers or the actual Flutter developers recommend, I was like, this could be a good use case for using the provider framework. So the auth provider class is going to be the only class in the whole entire app that is going to be using the provider framework, and we're just going to use the provider framework to actually communicate with the auth provider class. Apart from this, all other classes are just going to be solely based on Firebase and how it manages all of its state internally, and we won't be using the provider framework for that. But do not think that that's going to cause you to limit your understanding of the provider framework, because we're going to use the provider framework in such a way that you'll have a good understanding of all the fundamental concepts of the framework. So with that out of the way, let's get going. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to import, and what I'm going to import is going to be the Firebase auth package. So I'm just going to do Firebase auth, and I'm just going to see where Firebase auth is. So Firebase _ auth, and then I'm just going to click the package, Firebase auth dart. Okay, so now that we have the Firebase package, what I'm going to do is that I'm going to go down, I'm going to create a class, and I'm going to call my class auth provider. And this is going to extend a change notifier. And for this, we also had to import our material library. Since I like to actually arrange my import statements, I'm going to put the material library at the top because that's a Flutter package, and then I'll put the Firebase at bottom, and I'll do command save. Okay, so with now our auth provider class defined, what we're going to do is actually start defining some stuff inside of our class. So the first thing I'm going to do is that I'm going to create a static instance of our auth provider class. Reason behind this is because we only want one auth provider inside of our application. We do not want multiple authentication providers, and it makes sense to just have one authentication provider, because that's going to just control all of the authentication flow inside of our application. Creating multiple authentication providers is going to be a problem, and since we won't know which authentication provider to ask data from, and this can lead to inconsistencies in our app and potential buggy nature of our app. So we'll have a static member of our class, and it's going to be of type auth provider, and we'll just instantiate a new instance of our auth provider class. Now I'm going to create the constructor for our auth provider, and then I'm just going to leave it empty for now. I just wanted to define it. Okay, so with that, the next thing we're going to do is that we're going to create the actual function that is going to log our user in. And this function is going to be of type void. So this function is going to return anything, and it's going to be called login user with email and password. And you guessed it, this function needs two arguments passed to it. The first is going to be string of type email. The second is also going to be a string, and not a string known as email. And then the second is also going to be a string, and it's going to be password. Okay, now what we're going to do is that we are going to implement a try statement, and I'll tell you what a try statement is. So a try catch statement, what it does is that it tries to execute the code inside of our try block, and if in any of those steps an error occurs, then the catch block is executed and the program does not crash. So we can actually handle if any errors occur, and they would occur in the case that we actually try to log in with an invalid user, then the catch block is going to be ran, and I'll explain this as we go along. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is that I'm going to go back to our auth class to the top of it, and I'm going to, on top of our instance variable, I'm going to define a new variable, and this variable is going to be of type Firebase auth, and it's going to be _auth. And the reason it's _auth is because we do not want it to be accessible outside of our auth provider. And then what I'm going to do is that I'm going to do _auth dot, and then I'm going to do auth dot sign in with email and password. And then once we click on sign in with email / password or comma password, I'm going to pass in the email that gets passed into us and the password that gets passed in to us. And then I'm just going to end the statement with a semicolon. I'm going to do command save. So now it's signing us in, but how do we know if we signed in? How do we actually track state? How do we manage if the user is authenticated or not? So to address that issue, what I'm going to do is that I'm going to create a new variable, which is going to store the status or the current authentication status of our application. So it's going to be a variable, and the variable is going to be of type auth status. And this is a custom class that we're going to define, and I'll call it status. I'm going to go to the top, and instead of creating a class, what I'm going to create is going to be an enum. And then the enum is going to be of type auth status, and enum is just short for an enumeration. And then our auth status can be multiple things. So the first one is that not authenticated, so that our user is not authenticated at all. The other one is going to be authenticating, so that we are in the process of actually authenticating the user. One is going to be authenticated. Then it's going to be user not found. And the other one is going to be error. So our auth status that was simply that we received an error. And for our use case, these were the enum statuses that covered most of the use cases or all of the use cases, but depending on your use case, maybe you would need more or less auth status. Okay, so now we don't get the error. Now what I'm going to do is that every time we create our auth provider instance class, what I'm going to do is that I am going to take the actual Firebase auth instance. So what I'm going to do is that I'm going to do Firebase auth.instance, and I'm going to store that inside of our auth variable. So now we have access to our Firebase auth variable, and now what we can do is click on auth.signin with email and password and do email and password. But even now we have no idea as to what the status of the user is and is he authenticated or not. And now we're going to work towards that. So when we actually start the login user with email and password function, or we actually start this process, I'm going to update the status, and I'm going to update the status to auth status and not authenticated dot authenticating. And then I'm going to call a function that is derived from our change notifier class, and that's notify listeners. And I'll explain in a later video what notify listeners is. Then we're going to come into our try block, and we're going to do auth.signin with email and password. And if you hover over this function, you're going to see that it returns a future of type auth result. So what I'm going to do is that I'm going to save the result that we get from this function in a variable. So I'm going to define a variable that will be of type auth result, and I'm going to call this result or underscore result, and then this would be equal to our auth.signin with email and password. But since this returns a future, what we have to do is actually await for this process to complete. So I'll add the await statement, but an await statement can only be used inside of an asynchronous function. So what I'm going to do is that mark our function as async. Now what we're going to do is that once we have the result, we are going to actually get the user from the result and actually save that user. So I'm going to create another variable, and this variable is going to be of type Firebase user, and we'll just call it user. And then once we get the result, we're going to do user is equals to our result that we got dot the user. Okay, that what we're going to do is that we're going to change the status to auth status dot authenticated. And then what we're going to do is that we are going to navigate to home page, and we'll just leave this comment here and we'll update this logic later. And for now, what we can do is we can do print logged in successfully and do command save. Okay, so I think that I'm going to break this video into two separate parts. So now in the next video, we are going to continue working on our auth provider class and actually work on the catch block of our class. So with that, I'm going to end this video here, and I'm going to see you guys in the next one. Peace.